So you ready to do this? Let me get started.
Ready.
I want to do a formal. All right, let's do this. So look, thank you everybody for being patient with us and for joining us tonight. This is the 5th installment that we've done here at Texas A&M, where when the pandemic hit, a group of students came up to me about doing some of these Instagram live sessions. I had never done them before, and as you have witnessed right there in front of everybody in live, I don't know what I'm doing clearly, but I am thrilled to be joined by Professor Johanna Ferna. Let me do a quick, we got to do it. I got to do a quick bio on you here real quick. Professor Fernandez is a professor of history at Baruch College of the City University of New York, and editor of Writing on the Wall, selected prison writings from Mumia Abu Jamal, and the author of the newly released The Young Lords, A Radical History, which we will be talking about tonight. UNC Press 2020. If you don't have a copy of this yet, make sure you get it. We're going to be referencing it, and we're going to be talking about it tonight. Professor Fernandez, thank you so much for joining us tonight. And I should tell everybody here who's on here now that we had you here in College Station. You were our guest right before the pandemic hit. And I will never forget stopping in a McDonald's at 2 in the morning in Caldwell, Texas, to get you an order of a 20-piece McNuggets. As we made it to College Station. What a crazy night. So thank you.
Okay, can I talk about that?
What's that?
Where did you go?
I'm here. My phone fell, but that's all right. This is the energy that's in the room tonight. So it's okay.
Beautiful.
The phone falls,
okay.
everything.
Okay, everybody, because Dr. Hinojosa is calling me Dr. Fernandez. I think that maybe you're going to ask me about like what I like to eat and the like.
Yes.
First of all, I don't eat McDonald's, but I showed up in Podunk, Texas at 2 o'clock in the morning and I was starving. And so I would have liked to have gone to like a beautiful chic restaurant, but nothing was open and I needed to eat. And I thought that my host was going to bring me something to eat, but
you would think
he didn't. So I was like, let's go to the McDonald's.
You would think that the host who's at the airport at midnight would have something. Why wouldn't this person?
Exactly. But anyway, everybody, his mother is not very happy with him because he showed up barehanded. Con nada.
Con nada, not even like some pan dulce.
Not a Coke, nothing. No, it was pretty amazing that you drove all the way to the airport. I wanted to actually rent a car and get to the school myself, but you were like, no, we will pick you up.
No,
and that's beautiful. That's incredible.
Anybody who knows the trip from Austin to College Station, that's not a trip you want to be making at 1 in the morning. That's right. Just not. You just don't want to be on the road at that time, especially if you don't know the area. But that was amazing.
Yeah,
and we had a great time.
It was hilarious.
We had a great turnout. You packed the room that night, and we were able to give away for free 25 or 30 books that night of yours.
Wow, yeah. Thank you. That was beautiful.
And you were gracious enough to take all of the time you needed to sign that for all of the students and everything, and that was really fantastic. So thank you. And let me just jump in. I'm going to jump in because I have
yes. Enough already. Vamos.
So in all of this, tell us a little bit about where you grew up. What do you love to do for fun outside of work? Tell us anything. Introduce yourself to the folks.
Okay, so I grew up in the Bronx, New York, and I went to public schools in the Bronx and to high school in Manhattan. Other than where I was born, what do you want me to say? Tell me again.
What hobbies? What did you love to do growing up?
You know, I'm the child of immigrants, and you know that immigrants keep their kids on lock, especially their girls. So, like, getting out of the house, that's what I wanted to do. Get out of the house. But I did develop a love for dance for whatever reason, like modern dance, ballet, African dance, when I was in high school, and I took dance for free at a cultural center called The Door for wayward youth. Although I wasn't wayward, but that really changed me, I think. To connect to my body and creativity was something that I didn't really have access to. And it just built discipline, but also a love for aesthetic. And I don't know, it deepened my soul to take dance as a young person. And, you know, I think in another life I might have been a dancer.
You're someone that is always busy. You're always doing really great work, whether it's in the community or in academia, the work that you publish, the work that you do. In the midst of this pandemic, how is it that you are staying sane and taking care of yourself? Whether that be, you know, I don't know if it's still dance or if it's other things. Tell us about that. What are you doing right now to make sure that you're good, that you're taking care of yourself?
Who said I was taking care of myself? But let me tell you, I'm a workaholic, and I owe this to my immigrant parents and their crazy work ethic. I'm always working. Something is always calling on me. I say yes to too many things. I don't know how to say no. But this weekend, I was kind of low-key miserable. And I was trying to figure out, why the hell am I just low-key miserable? Like, I'm not depressed. I'm just a little low-key miserable. And it was because I was overworked and I hadn't really taken a break, even though I did go away. I was in Vieques not too long ago, but I had a number of writing deadlines and I had to read a manuscript, and it wasn't really a vacation. I was on it. And this weekend that just passed, I just did nothing. I twiddled my thumbs and I slept. Sleeping.
That's it.
Helped. Just sleeping, because I'm now doing a morning show on WBAI. So about WBAI is a community radio station here in New York, long-standing, has been around since 1959. It amplified the radical voices of the 60s. In fact, the Young Lords had a program on WBAI called Palante, which in English means forward in motion, or right on. So the station was shut down by its parent station, Pacifica, in October. A judge ordered the station reopened. And when it reopened, I was asked to host the morning show. And I was like, absolutely not. I don't do radio. I'm a professor. And they called and called and called and called. I said, no. And I can't really say no for too long. So then I said yes. And I said, I will do this for 3 months while you figure out who's going to be your morning host, because I can't, because I'm working full time. And radio is a lot of work. And it's been like 8 months now. And what's incredible is that I was able to have this platform in the middle of the pandemic in New York, and in the context of the uprisings following the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. So it's been a phenomenal experience, a learning experience. But among the many things I did 3 or 4 months ago was that I interviewed one of the first people to have gotten coronavirus in New York, one of the first people who was hospitalized. And I interviewed him on his experience. There was a media blackout, or there was not a lot of information on what to expect. What was this thing? What did it feel like? What are the symptoms? When you should go to the hospital. And I feel that I was able to provide a very important service to the people of New York who listen to WBAI during this horrible period in New York when there were portable morgues outside of hospitals because the number of body bags were so big. The number was so big that that in hospitals that literally morgue trucks were parked everywhere in the city, and it was a moment of trauma, of crisis, but also of coming together. And so I've been running because I'm on the radio 3 or 4 times a week.
I know that you produced a film in 2010, so you're active in more than just sort of more traditional sort of academic, just the writing. You're doing radio. Had you done radio before?
No, I've been interviewed on radio, but I've never done radio. Absolutely not. So
how do you even prepare for that?
I was thrown into the water with the shark, and I had to swim. It's an intense process. You prepare the news. You get bites of sound. People talking about the issues that you're amplifying in the news. You want to throw music in there. You need to interview 1 or 2 people, and you need to offer some kind of analysis of the news and the world in motion.
Yeah.
And you know what? I'm a historian, so that helped tremendously. Just
how so? Tell me. Give me an example.
Just offering historical perspective on the health crisis of the moment. So, for example, and this is with my own personal research, but we teach 20th century U.S. history, and this is not the first rodeo in terms of a pandemic or even a health crisis or a crisis of white supremacy and police brutality. So just to give you a sense of how my work with the Young Lords helped my analytical offering or perspective to my audience, we heard a lot about pre-existing conditions and the fact that Black Americans and Latinos had all of these pre-existing conditions, and they were 2 and 3 times more likely to die because of pre-existing conditions and because of race. So that is a very confusing explanation of why people of color are dying at higher rates. The real reason is poverty and inequality in healthcare, and the fact that the hospitals that poor people go to and people of color disproportionately go to are falling apart. And if the hospital is falling apart and overpopulated, you're not going to get the care you need. In fact, my uncle died in a Bronx hospital. And in that hospital, Lebanon Hospital, there weren't enough beds. There weren't enough beds in the ICU. And so part of what the doctors had to do was that they had to triage, meaning that they had to decide on an analysis of which patients they thought were more likely to survive, who they were going to let live and who they were going to let die.
Yeah.
Who was going to get the what's it called, the oxygen, the ICU bed.
Right.
And who was not. The Young Lords, the Puerto Rican counterpart of the Black Panther Party, identified the crisis among Puerto Ricans and Black Americans and Mexicans in Chicago in poor neighborhoods as one of diseases of poverty. So it's not race, it's poverty. It's the fact that people of color and working class people disproportionately work under the worst conditions, have less access to nutritional foods, and therefore develop hypertension and diabetes.
Yeah.
People of color, especially in cities like New York, are disproportionately living in buildings where the lead-based paint hasn't been stripped down. And so children in these environments eat the chips of lead paint that fall from the walls. That's not a pre-existing condition.
Yeah.
That's a disease of poverty.
Right, right.
And so the young lords, more accurately, I feel, were able to explain in that period, but also today, the root causes of this discrepancy in deaths in this COVID-19 era.
So I want to back up just in case there are folks that don't know who the Young Lords are. You gave sort of a brief definition in there, but I want to go back because I and maybe start from the beginning in terms of.
I got ahead of myself. Yes.
No, that's fine. That's fine. But I wonder, like, when you came and gave your talk here, one of the things that you said was that you had been working on this book right here, The Young Lords of Radical History. You'd been working on that book since God was a boy, you said. That has stuck with me. These works do take a long time. Two quick questions as you tell us about the Young Lords and introduce them to us. How long did it take you to write this book? And what got you interested in the Young Lords in the first place?
It took me so long to write this book that I don't remember what's in it anymore. This was
you got some great photographs, and we're going to talk about that.
Oh so. My yes. I remember the photographs. If they're pretty, I remember them. Okay, so I wrote my dissertation on the Young Lords when I was a graduate student at Columbia University here in New York City. I don't know to what extent your students understand the process of becoming a professor, but you go to graduate school, you enroll in a PhD program, and you have to write first a master's thesis and then a dissertation after you take classes and take exams, which are sometimes written and oral, or one or the other. So the dissertation is an exploration of an area of history, narrow usually, that has been unexplored. Mm-hmm. That's what professors and people who get PhDs do in the academy. They expand our understanding of human phenomena. So I decided to write a book on the Young Lords because, not a book, but my dissertation on the Young Lords, because no one had really written about the Young Lords. No
had anybody?
No, mine was the first dissertation. Wow. Mickey Melendez had not yet written his book. We Took the Streets.
We Took the Streets.
So that was in the 1990s. I finished my PhD in the late 1990s. I got into Columbia, and I finished my PhD in 2004. But I also wrote my master's thesis on the Young Lords. So, and of course, no one knew about the Young Lords. It wasn't a hip and happening thing. When you mentioned the Young Lords, people looked at you like you had three heads.
Really?
Yeah. Of course, nobody knew about the Young Lords. I mean, a lot of people don't know about the Young Lords now, but definitely not then. It wasn't the thing. So I'm happy to say that I contributed to making the Young Lords a thing in the academy, but also in the public sphere. Yeah. So since the late 1990s, I've been working on something related to the Young Lords. And then I finished, and everything went on hold. I finished my PhD. I was teaching for 3 years at Trinity College, but then I got a postdoctoral fellowship, and I landed at Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh, an incredible place. And I started visiting prisoners on death row, including the political prisoner, Mumia Abu-Jamal. And that kind of took over my life for a long time. And I veered away from the Young Lords, and I made a film about the case. What is fascinating is that Mumia, who's a former Black Panther, was sent by the Black Panther Party to Lincoln Hospital. So he was deployed to do work alongside other activists, including the Young Lords and the Black Panthers at Lincoln Hospital, a hospital that the Young Lords occupied in 1970. So working with Mumia Abu-Jamal was not entirely tangential, because he was a member of the Black Panther Party, and the Young Lords were the Puerto Rican counterpart of the Black Panther Party.
How did you first, like, who introduced you to the Young Lords? Who was it? How did you first meet them? Were they suspect? Were they like, who are you? Why are you trying to interview me?
Oh,
like,
my
how
goodness.
how
Wait,
did that go?
have I told you why how I learned about the Young Lords? Do you know the story?
No.
Like, how does one learn about the Young Lords?
Right.
I grew up in the Bronx and went to public schools, but somehow I ended up at a ruling class institution at Brown University, an Ivy League school. My junior year.
You're pretty smart. I mean,
my junior, but yeah, but I mean, listen, whatever that means, smart people are not born. You
right.
actually
Exactly. Yeah.
have to do the work, and I
Right.
haven't always known everything I know now.
But you do the work. You do the work.
Trained, we submit ourselves to a process of discipline, training, reading, thinking, arguing, attempting to lecture and give talks and making a mess and doing it again.
Right.
I was also hugely involved politically when I was in college and in graduate school, and that expanded my my analytical muscle hugely, maybe even more than graduate school, but ultimately both combined I credit with my work on the Young Lords and the book that I'm very proud of. Okay, so Brown hired its first Latino studies professor. I think I told you this, my junior year. Professor Suzanne Obler.
Oh, yes, you did tell me this. Yes, I remember. But
And
this
of
is a great
course,
story.
every Latino student at Brown took the damn courses she taught.
Right,
And
right,
in one of those courses, she talked about the Young Lords. And I learned that the Young Lords had occupied a hospital in the Bronx, Lincoln Hospital, that I was very familiar with. I used to translate for my parents at Lincoln Hospital whenever they went to the hospital. And these were self-proclaimed revolutionaries, Puerto Rican nationalists who believed in the independence of Puerto Rico, believed that Puerto Rico was a colony of the United States. And they were badass and bright and very young. And I was shocked that I had grown up in the Bronx and never heard about these fierce Puerto Rican, but also Black American and Colombian and Mexican and Dominican members of the organization. It was a very multi-ethnic cohort of revolutionaries. So that's how I learned about the Young Lords from my professor, from my Latino studies professor at Brown. If she wouldn't have been hired, I probably would not have gone to graduate school, to tell the truth.
Well, thank you to Suzanne Obler for sure. She's done great things for the field as well. So how was it first connecting to these Young Lords?
Okay, yes. So, the Young Lords experienced an enormous amount of repression in the 1970s at the hands of the counterintelligence program of the FBI. And so I encountered a group of people, fierce 60s radicals who were very suspicious and very distant. I'm looking for a word. They were just standoffish is the word I'm is the term they were very standoffish, suspicious, but I was a student. And so they were generally open to sharing their experiences with me. But it wasn't easy. It wasn't easy. But once they opened up, they shared dozens and dozens of stories, and I learned a lot from them. They were inspiring. One of the fascinating things about 60s radicals and 60s activists, generally speaking, is that the movement became their university. And so members of the Young Lords were predominantly working class children of migrants who were either college dropouts or high school dropouts, who were mostly educated in the worst public schools in Chicago and New York. But as I was interviewing them, these were the most articulate and lucid people I'd ever listened to, even more lucid and articulate than my professors, because the movement became their university. And some members of the Young Lords shared with me that when they joined the organization, they didn't know how to read and write. And members of the organization taught them how to read and write through political education by reading Don Pedro Albizu Campos or the writings of Karl Marx, or Che Guevara, Frantz Fanon. This was a moment when young people were doing an enormous amount of political education and reading because the stakes were high. They wanted to change society, and in order to do that, they needed to understand the root causes of social problems, the social problems that they were fighting against.
Yeah. You have some incredible photos in the book. And I think one of the things that really sort of stands out about the book is the way in which, and let me see if I can find some really, the way in which these photos are positioned. You don't generally see a photograph that takes up the entire page, right? You have a lot of photographs on here. I wonder if you could talk to us about when you knew that photographs were going to be so central to the book, and how did you go about collecting them? Who did you talk to? How did this whole thing sort of take place? Because it's not easy to get photographs and then have all the permissions that you need to put them in the book.
Right. So this was not something that happened overnight. I actually gave a talk at a Black Power conference at the University of Illinois, Chicago, or no, the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana. So I gave a talk on the Young Lords, the Puerto Rican counterpart of the Black Panther Party, at a Black Power conference. I was either invited or I submitted a proposal, and my proposal was accepted. And at the end of my talk, a professor at UNC, Chapel Hill, just approached me and asked me if I wanted to do an art exhibit, a joint art exhibit about the Young Lords and the Black Panthers. And I was like, sure, no problem. But I didn't even think about it. I was like, okay, whatever. I can't say no. So I was like, sure. I don't know what the hell I'm getting into. I've never done an art exhibit, but I'll do it.
Yeah. You were at the point where you're saying yes to a lot of things at that time.
I say yes to everything. It's not a great thing. That's why it's taken me a million years to write the book. I say yes, sure, no problem. Let's do it. If it sounds exciting, and that sounded interesting, but I didn't really know what I was getting into. And then that was an incredible process of looking for photographs, of examining photographs, of identifying themes for the exhibit, choosing photographs on the Young Lords that might mirror those that we were selecting on the work of the Black Panther Party. And part of what ended up happening was that a world of understanding opened up to me that I hadn't previously considered, which is the study of history through photography. Historical photographs. So one of the things that became clear to me as I was looking at all of these photographs was, oh my God, the young lords are disproportionately Afro-Puerto Ricans. I didn't know. If you don't look at the photographs, you don't see it.
Exactly. Yeah.
All kinds of amazing things. And then I looked at people who looked like they were not Afro-Puerto Ricans, but they looked like they were African Americans, Black Americans. And I learned that, oh my goodness, this was a profoundly multi-ethnic organization. There was a woman who looked Dominican. I'm Dominican. I was like, that woman looks Dominican. That's a Mexican. So, if you take a second look at photography while you're doing historical research, you will discover things that have not been documented in the written record.
Yeah. And one of the things that you mentioned was this idea that that the young lords were predominantly Puerto Rican, but not completely Puerto Rican. And it's the same, the case in Chicago, right? In terms of it's where the movement actually begins in terms of it being multi-ethnic. When you're looking at these photographs, where did you go? Are you in archives? Did you meet somebody? Did you meet a photographer? How are you sitting with these photographs that nobody's seen before?
So mostly you find a photographer that you know photographed the period and the activities of the organization. And I knew because, you know, you ask questions and people tell you, the folks that you're interviewing are giving you an enormous amount of information.
Yeah.
And I, of course, recorded all of these interviews, right? And transcribed them and studied them. And so the name Hiram Maristani kept on coming up. Hiram Maristani, you have to interview and talk to Hiram Maristani. And he was a young lord, but also the resident photographer of the organization who had previously been trained by an anti-poverty program. One of the federal programs launched by the government to fight poverty in the war on poverty, that was launched in part in response to protest against poverty in the 1960s.
Yeah.
So you identify the photographer, and then you sit with the photographer for hours and hours and hours and hours, and you know about this, and hours in the case of Hiram Maristani on end, and he tells you all of the stories about this photograph and when it was taken and why it's important. And part of the work involves, you know, respecting and honoring the important documentary work that someone like Hiram Maristani did. Although he's not just a documentary photographer, he's also like an artist. His photographs are dramatic, beautiful. They capture the essence and the spirit of the organization. So you know what is important about the photographs? That they are a window into the soul of the work you're doing. If you happen to find a treasure trove of photographers and their photographs who are really committed to this art.
When in 2015.
Okay, so you were drinking. You're drinking y yo aquí. So let me see, because I don't drink often, but go ahead. I'm listening.
Bueno, ahorita cuando te prepares, we'll do a cheers, an official one, because
okay. Let me see if this is working. So I can't drink wine because it'll put me to sleep. So what I do drink are mimosas.
Okay.
And I usually drink passion fruit mimosas, but I didn't have the patience to make passion fruit, which I make from scratch.
You are the absolute best, by the way. You are amazing. I love it.
So I'm gonna use mango juice instead for my mimosa.
Mira, let me, while you're doing that, I'm gonna just narrate something because I think it's around 2014, where the museums in New York curate this Young Lords exhibit.
Right.
So I'm there in New York in 2015, and it was already open. I went to El Museo del Barrio to go see one of the exhibits. I was there on my own. I didn't know you at the time. I didn't know anybody. I was in the archives. I was at NYU.
Okay.
I even went up to Sleepy Hollow because they've got a great archive up there for a group that's called Acción Cívica Evangélica, which was a religious group in the 1970s in the city. So I'm everywhere. I'm traveling, walking up and down the city. And it's actually how I first meet Juan Gonzalez. It was that time that I was there, and I briefly get a chance to meet him.
And who's Juan Gonzalez?
So Juan Gonzalez, one of the Young Lords, very well known, co-anchor right now on Democracy Now! With Amy Goodman, right?
But he's also the author of the important book that everyone must read, Harvest of Empire.
Harvest of Empire, which I just taught a class last semester and assigned that book. It's a great text in Latino history. So what I don't know is when I'm in that museum and I'm like, wow, this is great. Here's a little kid from Texas, and everything in New York amazes me, right? I'm in awe. I'm in this museum. I'm like looking at these photographs. You were a part of that. How do you move from student who is just learning of the Young Lords in whatever years it was, to then by probably 12 or 14, being the centerpiece of putting an exhibit together?
Okay, so that's an amazing story. So thanks for asking the question.
Yeah.
But okay, so I had already, cheers.
Okay. Salud. Cheers.
Salud. Salud. Okay. So I had already done 2 exhibits. One at UNC, Chapel Hill.
That's right.
And one at DePaul University in Chicago.
Oh.
So it traveled.
Okay.
From UNC Chapel Hill to Chicago. So I had done an exhibit before. It's not easy, and I worked with other people. I wasn't doing this alone, right?
Sure.
So
sure,
that's important. Okay, so I get to New York. I get a job in New York. You have no idea what that means. I had been exiled from New York for years.
Yeah.
I was teaching in Hartford, Connecticut at Trinity College, and then I ended up in Carnegie Mellon in a deindustrialized city, Pittsburgh. I'm from New York. You got to come back home if you're from New York. So I was literally lighting candles to get back to New York. I finally got a job in New York by the grace of something. And so I am asked to give a talk at the Bronx Museum on the civil rights movement. The Bronx Museum was exhibiting the largest photography exhibit since the 1980s. And it had been in the South previously, and now it was at the Bronx Museum. A really fancy, honest to God, ruling class museum in the Bronx. Beautiful. That likes to expose poor people in the Bronx to the arts. Great. Okay. So I'm asked to give a talk on the Southern Civil Rights Movement, and I go in a history of slavery. The end of slavery leads to Reconstruction and the first civil rights movement. The counter-revolution is launched by the old planter class immediately after the end of slavery, wherein the old planter class regains power economically, politically, and ideologically in the South. And that's how we see the rise of the KKK. But then Black migration in the 20th century, and especially during World War II, leads to the civil rights movement. I like, you know, strictly Black freedom movement. At the end of that talk, someone in the back of the room raises their hand and they're like, "Professor, were there any Latinos in the civil rights movement?" And I'm like, well, funny you should ask, because I write about the Young Lords, the Puerto Rican counterpart to the Black Panther Party, and there were the Brown Berets, and the executive director of the museum asked me right then and there if I would curate an exhibit on the Young Lords.
Wow. Okay.
Okay, but that's not it.
That's not it.
So for 10 years, we're trying to raise funds for this exhibit. This was immediately after 9/11. Not immediately after, but 9/11 was still in the memory of the country. And so the Young Lords are kind of in this middle ground.
Right.
They were depicted erroneously as terrorists in the 60s. And they believed in armed self-defense, that Puerto Ricans and Mexicans and Native Americans and Black Americans have the right to defend themselves against white terror.
Right.
So our proposals, grant proposals, all got 10 out of 10, meaning brilliant, but they didn't get the funding because we were always told there isn't a critical perspective here of the organization. It was political.
Yeah.
We're not ready to amplify the history of this organization that believes in armed self-defense in the context of 9/11.
Yeah.
But then, so that's it. So because of that, we decide, well, why don't we have this damn exhibit in 3 different places so that we can share the costs, literally.
Right, right.
And that became the thing, because it also came at around the moment of Black Lives Matter. There had been a shift in consciousness. And then it became the hippest, most happening thing in New York. Everyone and their mother went to see it. The New York Times wrote about it. It was identified as one of the 10 best exhibits in the United States of that year.
Yeah. And it was phenomenal. As somebody that was coming in as an outsider looking in, to be able to have access in one place to all of those photographs, even the gift shop, they had a nice little, they were selling some of the T-shirts and things like that of the Young Lords. So it was really, as Bobby Rivera is pointing out here, it was amazing. There's no doubt about that. I'm going to sort of hurry up here to sort of get to my final questions in terms of your work, but I do want to ask you one other question about one of the photographs, because it's one of my favorites in here.
I wonder which one. Oh my God. Yeah, what page is it on?
This is 197. Does everybody see that? Look at that.
197. Oh my God, that's one of my favorite too. So in this chapter, the chapter is called "The Politics and Culture of the Young Lords." So part of what I do in this chapter is give a sense of like what it felt to be in the Young Lords. What were the politics of the organization? Members of the organization lived communally, as did a lot of the members of the New Left. That's what we call the cohort of young people who built the movements of the 60s, the women's movement, the anti-war movement, the gay and lesbian liberation movement, the Black Power movement, civil rights. Did I say anti-war? So they lived communally. And so I chose that photograph to give a sense of the kind of intimacy that was shared among comrades in the organization. who were dating each other. Yeah, so this is about revolutionary love right here on page 197 of my book.
Look at that.
It's a beautiful photograph. And and I got this photo from Henry Medina, by the way. Henry Medina is a former young lord who collects the posters and the photographs and the newspapers of the period, not just of the young lords, but of the movement in its totality. I don't know how I found out about this pretty early on. And so I met with Henry Medina in Long Island. I think he was living far from New York. And I scoured his collection. And this was one of the photographs in his collection.
Well, you've got quite an eye in terms of picking the photographs, because that's one of many just wonderful photographs that are in this book. I couldn't help. So I taught a grad seminar this past spring in the midst of this pandemic. Your book was scheduled to be the last book that we read, that we were supposed to discuss in April. We did discuss it. What came across to everyone in that Zoom chat that we were all on at that time was the incredible sense of hope that we were able to gain from the book. Just to see the photographs, just to read the ways in which this group had its ups and downs. You've got some great comments, and I could go line by line where they bought into their meteoric success, you write at one point. I don't know what page number that was, but you know, you really humanize the young lords, even as you help us to understand how incredible that they were. And that balance is quite, I think it takes work, as you mentioned earlier, in terms of what your work ethic brings to it. And I know that I remember telling my students this, that as we're reading this, as well as it reads, and as clear as it is, and as wonderful as it is at sort of highlighting the contradictions of groups like this, you know that the author went to, into a tremendous amount of work and labor and love to produce a book like this. So congratulations on doing that. I want to end with two questions that I have for you. The first is, are we going to be okay? I mean, everything that's going on, you've lived it. You were talking about the morgues early on in New York City and everything. What's your sense as somebody that does this work, that's talking to people every day, that's on the radio?
Are we going to be okay? That's such a complex question. Like, are we going to be okay individually, collectively, as a country? I think that depends on the work we put in. We're facing an apocalyptic situation across the country. Over 150,000 people have died of COVID-19. 50,000 Americans died in Vietnam. 50,000, and that was crazy, right? That number by historians is quoted as an epic number, and that happened over the course of almost 15 years. And we have lost 150,000 people in less than 3 or 4 months. So some of us are not going to be all right.
Yeah.
And that's hard, but that's the reality. And we're not going to be all right because we have an absolute failure on the part of the state in its response to a pandemic and a health crisis unlike any we've seen since World War I. We have a healthcare system that is organized around private medicine, not communal health. And the people who are suffering are the people in the Bronx. Where are you from?
From South Texas, Brownsville, the Valley, which is one of the
from
epicenters right now. Yeah.
You know what's fascinating about Brownsville is that in all of the statistics I've read, and I did a lot of work for Manning Marable. I did research for him.
Yeah.
He was my professor at Columbia. So he had me doing research on poverty and race. And Brownsville, Texas always came up as one of the poorest districts in the country, in competition with the Bronx.
Yeah.
And in these districts, people are going to suffer unnecessarily because of the inhumanity of our healthcare system. But there's hope because there's an uprising, unlike any we've seen recently in American history. It's a fierce one, and I think it landed in America in part because of the pandemic. Because when people are sick and when people are forced to look at death in the face, it puts them closer to their humanity.
Yeah, yeah. And let me just say, Instagram is giving us 1 minute here before they kick us off, and so let me just ask you one last question. What gives you hope these days, and then we'll wrap it up.
People's humanity gives me hope. People are beautiful. As horrible and narcissistic and evil as our president is, and many people are who are psychopaths, there are also people who sacrifice for something larger than themselves, who dream of a better world, and who offer their compassion and hearts to their neighbors. So good people inspire me. It gives me hope that we can live in a different world.
Professor Fernandez, I'm going to stop it there. Thank you so much. Thank you.